He had survived everything. Days of naval guns, bombs that ground coral into powder. On the Shuri Line, he had learned the one law that still held. Stay behind the rock, stay far away. American rifles could not climb this distance, and then across open ground no rifle could cross. A single shot found him. Not a burst, not luck. One deliberate shot from more than a mile away, a distance no rifle they carried could ever cross. The men who fired it were not snipers. They were machine gunners, working a weapon built to kill tanks and aircraft, aiming it one round at a time like a rifle from another world. It was never in their training. It was never in any manual. Similar battlefield improvisations with the M2 would later appear again in later conflicts, although no direct documented line connects specific Okinawa crews to those later developments. By the spring of 1945, the men fighting for the ridges of Okinawa did not know they were arguing with a decision made in another war by a man who was already dead. To understand the shot that crossed a mile of open air, you have to go back nearly 30 years to a conflict that had ended before this one began. In the last autumn of the First World War, the American Army had a problem the rifle could not answer. The battlefield had filled with steel. Tanks ground their way across the churned earth of France. Aircraft came in low over the trenches, close enough for a man to see the pilot's face. And the standard machine gun of the American forces, John Browning's water-cooled .30 caliber, was a magnificent killer of men and nothing else. Its bullets flattened against armor plate. They glanced off engine cowlings and fell away. General John J. Pershing, commanding the American Expeditionary Force, wanted something larger. Something that could tear through the hide of a tank, rip an aircraft out of the sky, and reach farther than any weapon the infantry had ever carried into a fight. So they built one. They handed the cartridge to Winchester, who developed a round half an inch across, driven by a charge that would push it faster than any bullet on the battlefield. And they handed the gun to John Browning, the most gifted firearms inventor who had ever lived, who designed a weapon massive enough to fire it. He drew on the lessons of his .30 caliber machine gun, the weapon already proving itself in the trenches. But this was a new beast, built around a new cartridge with the power to punch through metal. The weapon fired for the first time in the closing weeks of 1918, and then the war it was designed for simply stopped. The armistice came in November, and the great .50 caliber gun, born to kill the machines of a war that was already over, had nowhere left to go. It did not disappear. Through the 1920s and into the 1930s, the design was refined, hardened, and perfected until it emerged in 1933 as the weapon the world would come to know. The Browning .50 caliber, model of 1933, the M2, the troops who would carry it decades later gave it a name that sounded almost affectionate, worn smooth by a million hands. Ma Deuce, but the man who fathered it never saw what it became. John Browning died in 1926 in Liège, Belgium, while working on his designs at the arms factory there, years before his heavy gun found its final shape, and years before the war that would make it a legend. He built it to stop tanks and aircraft. He never imagined it would one day be aimed, one careful round at a time, at a single frightened man hiding in a hole on a Pacific island. That was never the purpose. That was never in the design. Nobody wrote it down because nobody thought it was possible. By the time the United States was drawn into the Second World War, the .50 caliber was everywhere. It rode in the wings of fighter planes and the turrets of bombers. It stood on the decks of destroyers and the hulls of tanks. And it sat, heavy and patient, on a squat steel tripod in the hands of the infantry. This mechanization was so heavy that the barrels and receiver alone weighed roughly 84 pounds of iron before you added the mount or a single belt of ammunition. It was a crew weapon, a burden shared between men, built to be fed long belts and fired in roaring bursts. That was the doctrine. That was what every manual in every army agreed a machine gun was for. It was an area weapon. You pointed it at a place, not a person. You aimed it at a tree line, a slope, a stretch of ground where the enemy might be, and you poured fire across the whole of it until the barrel glowed and the enemy kept their heads down. Volume, not precision. The rifle was the instrument of the marksman. The machine gun was the instrument of the storm. But the gun held a secret that the doctrine had overlooked. The ground version could be set to fire a single shot. One round, one deliberate pull, and then silence, the same as a hunting rifle in the hands of a patient man. It was a feature buried in the mechanism, mentioned in the technical pages, ignored by nearly everyone. Because why would you ever want a machine gun fire one bullet at a time? A few men noticed. One of them was Roy Dunlap, an ordnance man who followed the American guns across the Pacific and kept a careful record of what he saw them do. After the war, he wrote plainly what the manuals had buried in fine print. Every ground gun, he observed, could fire single shots, and when it did, the accuracy could be remarkable. The capability was there. It had always been there, sitting inside the metal, waiting for someone to reach for it. It was not taught in the training camps. It was not written into any order from above. It was discovered quietly in the field by men who studied the weapon in their hands and understood it better than the manual did. And what those men understood was this. The .50 caliber round left the muzzle at nearly 3,000 feet per second, faster than any bullet a rifleman carried. It stayed lethal well past a mile, farther than most soldiers believed a bullet could reach and still kill. On paper, its maximum effective range against a point target reached beyond 1,800 yards, out to distances where the enemy stood in the open and felt perfectly safe, because every law of war they had ever been taught told them that at such a range, no one could touch them. That belief was about to become the most dangerous assumption a man could hold. And on the far side of the world, on a long green island called Okinawa, an entire army had built its survival on it. For 3 years, the Japanese defenders of the Pacific had watched American firepower do the same terrible thing, island after island. Men who stood and fought in the open were annihilated. Beach defenses were shattered under naval guns before a single Marine came ashore. Mass charges melted away in front of American machine guns and artillery. The lesson was written in the blood of tens of thousands of their own dead. To meet American power in the open was to die. So on Okinawa, they chose not to meet it in the open at all. They chose to disappear into the earth. The mind behind that choice was a quiet, methodical staff officer named Hiromichi Yahara. A colonel, 43 years old, he was the senior operations officer of the 32nd Army, and he was, by temperament, the opposite of the shouting warrior of legend. He did not believe in glory. He believed in arithmetic. He had studied the Americans, and he understood with cold clarity that his men could not outshoot them, could not outsupply them, and could not outgun them. Every weapon the Americans brought was heavier, more plentiful, and more accurate than his own. But Yahara believed there was one thing his army could still do. It could refuse to die quickly. It could make the Americans bleed for every yard, every ridge, every cave, and drag the battle out until the cost became almost unbearable. He argued against defending the beaches, where the naval guns would tear his men apart. He argued against the wild banzai charges that had thrown away so many lives on other islands for nothing. Instead, he pulled the heart of his army back into the rugged high ground around the ancient castle town of Shuri, and there he built something the Americans had never fully faced before. It was not a line of trenches. It was a world beneath the ground. Miles of tunnels bored through coral and rock, connecting cave to cave, ridge to ridge. Firing positions carved into the reverse slopes of hills, the far sides, hidden from American eyes and shielded from the flat trajectory of American guns. When the naval shells came, and they came in the tens of thousands, the defenders simply withdrew deeper into the rock and waited for the storm to pass over empty ground. When the bombers roared overhead and turned the ridgelines to dust and smoke, the men who mattered were far below, listening, alive. His commander, Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima, 57 years old, and known for the rare quality of trusting the men beneath him, gave Yahara the freedom to build it. And what they built together became one of the most formidable defensive systems of the entire Pacific War, a fortress designed around a single brilliant, ruthless idea. If you cannot survive the American steel by facing it, then survive it by living underneath it. For a long time, it worked. The greatest concentration of firepower the world had ever assembled fell upon those hills, and the men inside them endured. Distance protected them. Rock protected them. The reverse slopes protected them from everything that flew in a straight line. They had engineered a kafas safety out of the very earth, and against the big guns, against the battleships and the bombers and the massed artillery, That safety held. But every wall in that fortress rested on one assumption. It was what nearly every soldier on that island had been taught. A machine gun could not aim. A machine gun sprayed. It suppressed. It was a weapon of the general area, not the individual man. Keep to the ground, the flat shooting guns could not reach, and the bursts which could pass you by. That was the rule. It was as close to a law of nature as anything a soldier could believe in. And on the ridges, Shuri, in the spring of 1945, a handful of American gunners, crouched behind a weapon built to kill tanks in a war that had ended before they were born, were about to discover that the rule had never been true at all. The rule broke slowly, the way most truths on a battlefield break. Not in a single dramatic moment, but in a series of small, quiet observations that added up over days and weeks to something no manual had ever admitted. It began with the ground itself. Okinawa was not the flat jungle-choked ground of the earlier campaigns. The southern third of the island where Yahara had built his fortress was a broken landscape of coral ridges and open valleys, of terraced fields and long bare slopes swept clean by fire. And in that kind of country, distance was not a number on a range card. Distance was everything. A man on one ridge could look across a valley at a man on the next ridge, half a mile away, and watch him move. Watch him work. Watch him live his small daily life in what he believed was perfect safety. For the Japanese defenders, that safety was the whole design. Yahara had built his line so that the men who observed the American advance, the spotters who called down the mortar fire, the who picked at the infantry, the machine gun crews who covered the approaches could do their work from positions the Americans could not answer. They fired and they withdrew. They watched from cave mouths that faced away from the guns. They moved between positions in the open because the open, at that distance, had always been safe. No rifle in the American arsenal could cross a valley and touch a man on the far slope. And then, one gun at a time, the Americans began to prove it wrong. Somewhere along the Shuri Line, in a moment no report recorded and no camera captured, a heavy weapons crew looked across one of those valleys at an enemy who felt untouchable, and one of them thought about the gun on the tripod beside him differently than he was supposed to. He knew it fired single shots. He knew the bullet flew flat and fast and hit with the weight of something closer to a small artillery shell than a rifle round. And he began to wonder what would happen if he stopped spraying and started aiming. This was the heart of it. Not a program, not an order. A shift in the mind of a man who understood his weapon better than the people who had trained him. The kind of quiet, practical intelligence that has always lived in the ranks of an army, in the men who take a tool built for one purpose and discover, through patience and attention, that it can do another. The American infantry on Okinawa were a mix of army divisions and Marines, and the Marines in particular had spent 3 years learning the Pacific the hard way. The 1st Marine Division, veterans of Guadalcanal, the nightmare of Peleliu, came ashore on Okinawa hardened by everything they had survived. The 6th Marine Division, newer as a unit but filled with experienced men, would grind through some of the worst fighting on the island. These were not raw boys. They were men who had buried friends on a dozen beaches, who had learned that the enemy was patient, disciplined, and willing to die in place. And they had learned to think about their weapons with the seriousness of men whose lives depended on it. When a gunner set his .50 caliber to fire single shots and laid the sights on a distant figure, he was not performing a trick. He was solving a problem that had been killing his friends. The Japanese spotters and snipers had been operating with something close to impunity, striking from ranges the infantry could not reach. The riflemen were outranged. The mortars could search a slope, but could not always find one man behind one rock. But the heavy machine gun, that ignored, misunderstood weapon of the storm, had the reach. It had always had the reach. It simply had never been asked to use it this way. The first shots would have been experiments, a round sent across the valley, watched, corrected. The gunners mixed tracer into their belts so they could see where the bullet went, a bright streak arcing across the open air, and from the fall of that streak they learned the language of the shot. How far the bullet dropped over that terrible distance, how the wind pushed it sideways, how long it took to cross, more than a second and a half of flight, so that a moving man had to be led, the sights placed not where he was but where he would be when the bullet finally arrived. And when the corrections came together, when the gunner had read the range and the wind and the drop, developed the crook ditch that should not have been possible. It reached across a distance no rifle could cross and struck a single man. Imagine it from the other side. That is where the horror of it lived. Imagine you are a Japanese soldier on the Shuri Line. You have survived the worst bombardment in the history of your war. You have felt the earth itself convulse under naval guns that fire shells the size of a man. You have learned the rules that keep you alive, and you trust them the way you trust the sun to rise. Stay in the rock when the big guns speak. And when you must move, when you must carry a message or shift a position or simply breathe fresh air after days underground, you know at the far ridge where the Americans crouch behind their sandbags is too distant to matter. A mile of empty air separates you. You have stood in that open ground 100 times. Nothing has ever reached you there. So you step out, and somewhere across that valley, without warning, without the ripping roar you have learned to fear, there is a single flat crack. And the man beside you falls, struck by something that hit him with impossible force, that came from a direction and a distance that your every instinct told you was safe. You do not understand it at first. No one does. The natural assumption is that the Americans have moved a sniper close, that some marksman has crept forward in the night. You look for the hidden rifleman who does not exist, because the truth to accept than the lie. The truth is that the killing came from the one weapon that been taught could never do this, the machine gun. The area weapon, the gun that sprays and suppresses and cannot pick a single man from a crowd at long range. Except now it could. Now it did, and the safe ground was not safe anymore. The change in behavior came quickly, and the Americans could see it through their field glasses. The casual movement stopped. Men who had walked between positions in daylight now sprinted, low and fast in short, desperate bursts. Observation posts that had been manned around the clock fell silent for hours at a time. The defenders learned to fear the open ground in a way they never had before, and fear for an army is a kind of paralysis. Every yard a man will not cross, every position a man will not occupy, every hour a man spends pressed into the rock instead of doing his job, is a small victory paid for by the men on the other side. But it is important to be honest about what this was and what it was not. This was not a campaign of long-range machine gun sniping that won the Battle of Okinawa. There is no neat record of a lone gunner and a running tally of kills at fantastic distances. That story belongs to a later war, and we will come to it. What happened on Okinawa was quieter and, in its way, more real. It was a tactic that emerged from the ranks unevenly in different places, wherever a thinking gunner and the right stretch of ground came together. It was the .50 caliber being used for what it could truly do, reaching into firing apertures, punching through the log and earth cover that stopped rifle bullets cold, denying the enemy the open daylight movement his defense depended on, making the middle distance, the ground between rifle range and artillery range, place where a Japanese soldier could die at any moment from a source he could not see and could not answer. And that middle distance mattered more on Okinawa than almost anywhere else because of how the battle was fought. Yahara's fortress did not fall to brilliant maneuver. It fell to grinding, brutal, close attrition, ridge by ridge, cave by cave, in a campaign that lasted nearly 3 months and became the bloodiest battle of the Pacific War. The Americans learned that they could not simply blast the defenders out. The naval guns and the bombers and the artillery could reshape the hills, but the men inside the rock survived, exactly as Yahara had planned. To take a position, the infantry had to come forward into the open, into the killing ground the defenders had prepared with such care. And it was there, in that lethal middle ground, that the .50 caliber earned its place. When the Marines assaulted a ridge, the heavy machine guns went with them or covered them from the high ground behind. And a gunner who could put single-aimed rounds into a cave mouth, into a firing slit, into the exact spot where an enemy machine gun would appear was worth more than any amount of wild suppressing fire. He could reach the places the riflemen could not. He could suppress a position not by drowning it in lead, but by promising that anyone who showed himself in that aperture would be killed precisely by a bullet heavy enough to smash through the cover meant to protect him. Consider what that meant to the men crawling forward under fire. A Japanese machine gun in a coral emplacement, firing through a narrow slit, was a fortress in miniature. Rifle rounds spanged off the rock around it. Grenades had to be carried close, through the beaten zone at terrible cost. But a .50 caliber gunner on the flank, patient and precise, could work that slit like a key working a lock. Round after heavy round, chewing at the aperture, until the position that had pinned an entire platoon fell silent. That was not sniping in the romantic sense. It was something grimmer and more useful. It was the reduction of a fortress, one deliberate shot at a time. The men who benefited from it rarely knew the name of the gunner who saved them. That is the nature of this kind of war. The infantryman pinned in a shell hole, certain he was about to die, felt the enemy fire slacken and did not know why. He only knew that the terrible slit on the ridge had gone quiet and that he was still alive and that he could move. Somewhere behind him, a heavy weapons crew wiped the sweat from their eyes and searched for the next target through the shimmering heat. They would never meet. They would never speak. But one had kept the other alive, and in the strange economy of the battlefield, that was enough. The heat itself was a character in this story. Okinawa in May turned to mud and misery week after week of rain that filled the shell holes and rotted the living along with the dead. And when the rain broke, the sun came down hard and the ridges shimmered, and the smell of the battlefield, a smell the survivors would carry for the rest of their lives, rose from the churned earth. The men who fought there were young, most of them boys who had grown up in small American towns during the Depression, who had learned to shoot on their father's farms, who had never imagined a place like this existed. And they aged decades in weeks. The 1,000-yard stare, the vacant, exhausted look of a man who has seen too much, got its name from this kind of fighting. There is something here that goes beyond tactics. These were ordinary men asked to do an extraordinary and terrible thing, and most of them did it not for glory but for the man beside them. The gunner who learned to reach across the valley was not a hero out of a film. He was a young man with a job to do and friends he wanted to keep alive, who looked at the tool in his hands and thought harder about it than anyone expected him to. That is the real texture of courage in a war like this. Not the grand gesture, the quiet competence, the refusal to accept that a thing could not be done when doing it might bring one more friend home. And still, honesty demands that we hold two things at once. The .50 caliber's reach was real, and it mattered, and it frightened an enemy who had believed himself safe. But Okinawa was not won by a wonder weapon. It was won by exhaustion, by numbers, by the slow, unbearable arithmetic that Yahara himself had counted on and in the end could not escape. The defenders were dying faster than they could be replaced. The tunnels that had sheltered them became tombs. Flamethrowers and satchel charges and tanks working with the infantry sealed cave after cave, sometimes with the living still inside. The fortress that had been engineered to survive American firepower was being dismantled, meter by American persistence. By late May, Yahara's line was breaking. The Shuri position, the anchor of the entire defense, could no longer be held, and the 32nd Army began a painful withdrawal to the south, giving up the fortress they had bled so long to keep. The retreat itself was a horror. Columns of exhausted men moving through the mud and the rain and the American fire, the wounded left behind, the whole careful collapsing into the final act. And here the reach of the weapons cut in a direction the Americans had not expected, because the .50 caliber and the long-range guns had made distance lethal for both sides. The middle ground belonged to no one now. It was simply a place where death could arrive without warning from a source unseen. On the 18th of June, in the closing days of the battle, that truth reached all the way to the top. Lieutenant General Simon Bolivar Buckner, the commander of the entire American 10th Army, the man who had directed the whole vast campaign, went forward to an observation post to watch his Marines make their final push. He was near the front, where a commanding general perhaps should not have been, but he wanted to see the end of the thing he had spent so many lives to win. A Japanese artillery position, one of the few still fighting, fired at the cluster of officers on the ridge. A shell struck the coral nearby, and a fragment of that shattered rock tore into his chest. Simon Bolivar Buckner, a lieutenant general, the highest-ranking American officer to be killed by enemy fire in the entire Second World War, died within minutes on a ridge on Okinawa, days before the victory he had built arrived. He had commanded the greatest concentration of firepower ever assembled for a Pacific battle, and it did not save him. On that island, in those final days, the lesson was the same for the private in the cave and the general on the ridge. There was no such thing as safe ground. The reach of modern weapons had erased it for everyone on both sides. 4 days later, on the 22nd of June, with his army destroyed and the battle lost, Lieutenant General Mitsuru Ushijima ended his own life in the traditional way of a defeated Japanese commander, in a cave on a hillside at the southern tip of the island. His careful fortress, the tunnels and the reverse slopes, and the engineered safety had held for nearly 3 months and had cost the Americans dearly. And it had not been enough. It was never going to be enough. Yahara's cold arithmetic had always ended here. But the colonel who had designed it all did not die in that cave. Ushijima, in his final orders, commanded Yahara to live, to escape if he could, to survive the battle, so that someone who understood what had truly happened on Okinawa would remain to tell it. It was an extraordinary order, and Yahara obeyed it. He shed his uniform, tried to slip through the American lines disguised as a civilian, and was captured. He survived the war, and years later he wrote it all down, the strategy and the reasoning and the slow catastrophe, the only senior staff officer for the 32nd Army to walk off that island alive and leave a record of the mind behind the fortress. So the battle ended, as all of them did, in silence and in ruin. The guns cooled. The living moved on to the next island, the next objective, the invasion of Japan in itself that every man dreaded and that, in the end, would never come. And the 50 caliber machine gun went with them, carrying inside it a secret that the men on Okinawa had discovered and would soon forget. Because what happened on those ridges, the aim shot, the single round reaching across the impossible distance, was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of one. The gunners who had learned it did not know they were the first draft of something. They did not know that the idea they had stumbled into, in the mud and the heat and the desperation of Okinawa, would outlive the war, outlive them, and return in another jungle, in another war, in the hands of a Marine whose name would become a legend. For a while, the idea simply vanished. When the Second World War ended, the armies that had grown to millions shrank back toward peace, and the hard-won lessons of 1,000 small firefights went with the men who had learned them. Those Okinawa gunners took off their uniforms and went home. They became farmers again, and mechanics and clerks, fathers. The thing they had discovered on the ridges above Shuri, that a heavy machine gun could be worked like a rifle and reach a man who thought himself safe, was not written into any manual, not turned into any doctrine, not taught to the next generation of young men learning the trade of war. It had lived in their hands and their instincts, and when they laid the gun down, it went quiet with them. The 50 caliber itself did not go quiet. Ma Deuce was too good to retire. It stayed in service on the tanks and the ships and the tripods, the same heavy, reliable killer it had always been. But the secret inside it, the precision that a patient man could coax out of it, waited. It waited through the late 1940s, through the uneasy peace, until the world went to war again, and new generation of young Americans found themselves fighting in the cold hills of a country called Korea. And there, someone remembered. In Korea, for the first time, the idea that had been improvised on Okinawa began to be done on purpose. American soldiers, holding fixed positions against an enemy who moved at great distances across open ground, took the 50 caliber and did deliberately what the Pacific gunners had done by instinct. They mounted telescopic sights on the big guns. They set them to fire single shots, and they reached out to strike men who believed themselves beyond the range of anything but artillery. It was still crude. It was still improvised position by position, gun by gun, but it was no longer an accident. The tool had found its second purpose, and this time men were beginning to write it down. Then came Vietnam. And in that war, in the hands of one man, the idea that had been born in the mud of Okinawa became a legend. His name was Carlos Hathcock. He was a Marine, a sniper, one of the finest marksmen the Corps ever produced. And he was the kind of quiet, patient, deadly professional that the men on Okinawa would have recognized instantly as one of their own. Hathcock did most of his work with rifle, but he understood the Fikafti caliber the way those forgotten gunners had understood it, and he took it further than anyone before him. He mounted a telescopic sight on an M2 machine gun, the same weapon John Browning had designed to kill tanks half a century earlier, and set it to fire a single shot. And in 1967, from a distance that strains belief, he used it to kill an enemy soldier at roughly 2,500 yards. Nearly a mile and a half. It was one of the longest confirmed kills anyone had ever recorded, a mark that would stand for decades. Think about the similarity between the two. On Okinawa, unnamed American machine gunners discovered that the M2 could be used with remarkable precision at long range through battlefield improvisation. More than 20 years later, Carlos Hathcock independently demonstrated the same potential of the M2 in Vietnam. Although the techniques were remarkably similar, there is no documented evidence that Hathcock learned this method directly from Okinawa veterans, or that an unbroken historical chain connected the two. And here is the truth that the title of this story only half told you, the truth we owe you before we finish. When people speak of Japanese soldiers terrified by Marines using machine guns as sniper rifles, they are reaching for something that is real at its core and exaggerated at its edges. The image of a lone gunner on Okinawa with a scope and a running tally of kills at fantastic ranges, that image belongs more to Korea and to Vietnam than it does to the Pacific. The polished, deliberate, scoped .50 caliber sniper system was not a Second World War weapon. It was born afterward, refined in Korea, made legend in Vietnam. What actually happened in the Pacific was quieter, and in some ways more honest and more human. There was no program. There was no legend. There were only thinking men crouched behind a weapon everyone told them was for spraying, who looked at the enemy across a valley and refused to believe there was nothing they could do. The reach was real. The fear it created was real. The dead men who fell in ground they thought was safe were real. But it was the work of instinct and necessity, not of doctrine and fame. It was a seed planted in the worst place on earth that would not flower until later wars. That is the more truthful story, and it is a better one, because it is not the story of a wonder weapon or a single hero. It is the story of how knowledge actually moves through an army and through history, not always in the manuals, not always in the medals. Sometimes it lives in the hands of ordinary men, gets forgotten when they go home, and waits, patient as the gun itself, for someone else to rediscover it and carry it one step further. The men who fought on Okinawa did not know they were part of that machine. The gunners who discovered that the .50 caliber could be aimed like a rifle did not think they were making history. They were simply trying to kill the enemy who was killing their friends and to stay alive one more in a place that seemed designed to consume them. Like so many veterans of that generation, many returned home without ever speaking much about what they had done or seen. And on the other side, the man who had designed the fortress lived to tell his half of it. Hiromichi Yahara, the cold and brilliant colonel, kept the promise his dying commander had forced upon him. He survived and he wrote, and because he did, we understand the mind behind those ridges in a way we understand almost no other Japanese defense of the war. He explained the arithmetic, the terrible logic of attrition, the plan to make the Americans pay so dearly that they might lose their will. It was a plan that came closer to working than we like to remember. Okinawa inflicted the heaviest American losses of any Pacific battle, and the memory of that cost weighed on every decision that came after, including the decisions that finally ended the war without the invasion of Japan that everyone feared. So when you stand back and look at the whole of it, the picture is lower than a single shot across a single valley. You see John Browning, dead in 1926, who built a gun to stop tanks and never dreamed of what it would become. You see the weapon he left behind, passed from hand to hand through a war he did not live to see. You see the young Americans on the ridges of Okinawa drawing out a secret precision no one had taught them, frightening an enemy who had engineered his own safety and found too late that safety was an illusion. You see Yahara and Ushijima and their fortress of tunnels, brilliant and doomed. You see Buckner, a lieutenant general, killed by a Bafreknov Choral days before his victory. Proof that in that war there was no rank high enough to purchase safe ground. And you see the idea itself, the reach, surviving all of them, traveling forward through Korea and into Vietnam, into the hands of Carlos Hathcock and the longest shots of their era, and onward still into the great anti-material rifles that armies carry to this day, firing the very same 50 caliber round John Browning's gun was built around. That is the real inheritance of those ridges, not a legend, something better, a line of hard-won understanding, drawn in blood, passed from one generation of soldiers, each one taking a tool built for one purpose and discovering, through patience and courage and terrible need, that it could do more. The men who first drew that lesson out of the 50 caliber on Okinawa are almost all gone now. So are the men they fought. The ridges above Shuri are green again, quiet again, the tunnels collapsed and sealed, the castle rebuilt, the terrible spring of 1945 fading into the pages of history books that fewer and fewer people open. But the gun endures. Ma Deuce is still in service, more than 90 years after it first fired, one of the longest-serving weapons in the history of the American military. And every time it speaks, somewhere in the world, it carries within it the echo of those forgotten gunners, the ones who looked across a valley on a dime and decided that the impossible was worth trying. They never asked to be remembered. Most of them never told the story at all, but they earned their place in it, in the mud and the heat and the fear, one deliberate shot at a time. And now at last you know their part in it, part that was true, the part that mattered. The quiet men behind the heaviest gun on the battlefield who taught it to do the one thing no one believed it could, and in doing so reached across not just the valley, but the decades, all the way down to us.